A single loaf, a hidden letter, and a truth no one saw coming. Welcome to Deadly Puzzle. I am your host, Edric Vale. Tell me where you're listening from. Your messages make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. It had rained the night before, one of those thin, persistent drizzles that Paris barely notices anymore. The pavements along Boulevard Richard Lenoir were slick, reflecting the yellowish street lamps like tired mirrors. Inside his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat in his shirt sleeves, a cooling pipe forgotten between his fingers, gazing at the window where the condensation blurred the city beyond. It was nearly 7:30 in the morning, too early for the usual summons from the examining magistrate, too early for the first interruptions from the young inspectors who, unlike him, always seemed to move in a hurry. The place had that peculiar emptiness of an institution not yet awake, the echo of someone's steps far down the corridor, the faint hum of the heating pipes. He had been thinking, without quite realizing it, about Madame Maigret's remark the night before, how the new baker in their street was a little too polite, as she put it. She hadn't meant it unkindly, merely as a passing observation over the dinner table, while spooning the pot-au-feu into his bowl, but the tone lingered in his mind. She had a way of noticing people without seeming to. He reached for the cold coffee at his desk and sipped it absently, his gaze drifting toward the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and yet there was a faint sound, the kind of cautious knock that could as easily be a mistake as an intention. "Come in," he said. The door opened a crack, and one of the uniformed constables, a young fellow with an expression that suggested he'd been sent on an errand he didn't understand, stepped inside. "There's a man, Chief. Says he has something to show you. Not urgent, he says, but strange. I told him to wait outside." Maigret didn't sigh, but he felt the weight of another morning that might begin in the small, slow way they sometimes did, not with a shot in the night, but with a man hesitating on a doorstep. "Send him in." The man who entered was in his 40s, with the pale, almost doughy complexion of someone who rose before dawn and spent the day in a warm shop. His overcoat still smelled faintly of yeast. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, holding his hat in one hand and, in the other, a small paper-wrapped bundle, grease seeping through at the corners. "You're the police," he began, as if he were still testing the idea out loud. "I'm not here to report a crime exactly. Not one I know of." "What's your name?" "Colin. Henri Colin. I run the bakery on Rue du Pont-aux-Choux. Bought it last year from old Monsieur Bréchet." "And?" Maigret's voice was mild. Colin placed the bundle on the desk and unwrapped it with deliberate care. Inside was half a round country loaf, neatly cut. In the center of the crumb, lodged like a seed in fruit, was a tightly folded piece of paper, browned at the edges. "I found it this morning," Colin said, eyes fixed on the bread as though it might explain itself. "One of the loaves in the back rack. Not from my hands. It was baked yesterday, I suppose, but I don't know by whom. I only noticed because the crust was too pale." Maigret leaned forward, examining it without touching. The paper looked as if it had been hidden before the baking. The edges had fused slightly to the surrounding dough. "You opened it?" Colin hesitated. "Yes, only I thought it might be some joke, but—" He produced another slip from his coat pocket, the same paper, unfolded now. The writing was cramped, hurried, the ink slightly blurred. It read, simply, "Help me. Rue de la Roquette, number 41. No signature. No date." Maigret sat back, feeling the slow, almost imperceptible tightening in his mind that came when a day's course shifted without warning. The drizzle outside was starting again, tapping faintly against the glass. Who else touched the loaf? No one. I keep the shop locked at night, but there's the apprentice Jules. He closes up sometimes. And there's a woman, Madame Lemoine, who cleans. Maigret didn't write anything down. He simply looked at Colin for a moment, long enough for the baker to avert his eyes. I'm not saying it's serious, Colin added quickly. Could be someone's idea of a prank. Still, when I read it, I thought, better to show you. The chief inspector reached for his coat and scarf, the decision made as quietly as if he'd only chosen to take a walk. Let's go, he said. I'd like to see your shop. The young constable blinked as Maigret passed him in the corridor, pipe in hand, the baker following in silence. Somewhere behind them, the building's radiators gave a hollow knock, as though marking the start of a day whose shape no one yet knew. The rain outside was finer now, almost a mist, blurring the outlines of the street. Maigret pulled his collar up and lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly against the damp air. He felt that curious twinge. Not urgency, but an awareness that somewhere, in a street he knew, someone had decided to send a message by hiding it inside a loaf of bread. It was a strange way to ask for help, and in Maigret's experience, strange ways usually meant someone was afraid. The shop was still warm from the morning's baking when Maigret stepped inside. A faint sweetness lingered in the air, mixed with the heavier scent of yeast and the earthy note of flour dust that had settled along the counter. It was a narrow place, the kind of bakery that seemed to hold its breath once the early rush had passed. A glass display case ran along one wall, half filled with pastries and a few lonely brioches, their sugar glistening faintly in the dim light. Behind it, shelves held what remained of the day's bread, rows of baguettes cooling in uneven lines, a couple of dark rye loaves, and an empty space on the middle rack where the round loaf had been taken. Colin moved around the counter with the unconscious precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times, reaching for his apron as if to reassert the role he knew. It's quiet now, he said, glancing toward the front window, where the rain was drawing thin streaks down the glass. After 9, you only get the odd passerby. Maigret nodded, not replying. His eyes moved slowly across the room, the narrow back door half ajar, a bucket and mop leaning against the wall, a small wooden stool with a dusting of flour on the seat. The silence was not quite complete. Somewhere in the back, there was the faint, irregular clink of metal against wood, the sound of someone moving without hurry. That'll be Jules, Colin said, catching the inspector's glance. He's finishing up in the kitchen. Bring him here, Maigret said mildly. The apprentice appeared a moment later, wiping his hands on the front of his overalls. He was younger than Maigret expected, 18, perhaps 19, thin and pale, with the restless eyes of someone unused to being studied. He nodded to Maigret without speaking, looking instead toward his employer. This is the chief inspector, Colin said. He's here about something we found. Maigret let the silence settle between them for a moment, watching the boy shift his weight from one foot to the other. Then he asked, You close up here sometimes? Sometimes, yes, when Monsieur Colin has deliveries or if he's gone for the evening. Last night, Jules hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he had to take bread to a restaurant near Bastille. You were alone here? For a while. Then Madame Lemoine came to clean. Maigret's gaze lingered on him. Did you bake all the loaves yesterday? Jules shook his head quickly. No, just the baguettes and some croissants. Monsieur Colin did the country loaves in the morning. Except, he trailed off, glancing at the baker. Except what? Maigret prompted. There was one on the rack in the back when I came in yesterday afternoon, Jules said, lowering his voice slightly. It wasn't ours. I mean, I didn't see it being made. It was already baked, but it looked different. Lighter crust. I thought maybe it was from the supplier. Sometimes Monsieur Colin buys a few extra if we run out. Colin frowned. I didn't buy any yesterday. The boy shifted again, clearly uneasy. Well, I didn't think much of it. I just put it on the middle rack with the others. Maigret let the silence work. Jules looked away, his jaw tightening slightly, as though holding something back. The inspector did not press him. Instead, he walked slowly toward the back of the shop, gesturing for them to follow. The kitchen was compact but efficient, with a long wooden table dusted in flour, racks along the wall holding tins and trays, and the great iron oven that radiated a steady heat. A small window looked out onto a narrow courtyard, where the rainwater had collected in shallow puddles. "You lock the back door at night?" Maigret asked, glancing at the simple latch. "Yes," Colin said. "But during the day, it's often open, for deliveries, for air." The inspector moved closer to the window. The sill was clean, but the stone just beneath it showed two faint scuff marks, parallel, as if something or someone had rested there recently. He didn't comment, only filed it away. "When Madame Lemoine came last night," he said, turning back, "did she come through the front or the back?" "The back," Jules said. "She always does. She has her own key." "And she was here alone at any point?" The boy's eyes darted briefly to Colin before he answered. "I went out for cigarettes once. She was in the shop." Colin's frown deepened, but he said nothing. Maigret took out his pipe and turned it in his hand, unlit. "Where is Madame Lemoine now?" "She comes in at noon to clean the upstairs flat," Colin said. "We keep some storage up there. I'd like to speak to her." The rain had intensified, drumming softly on the small awning over the shop's entrance. Maigret glanced once more around the kitchen, letting his eyes linger on the oven door, the cooling racks, the half-empty flour sacks in the corner. Everything was ordinary, almost banal, yet somewhere in that ordinariness, someone had hidden a plea for help. When Madame Lemoine arrived, she came in with the air of someone accustomed to slipping in and out without drawing notice. She was in her 50s, her hair pinned back neatly, her clothes sensible but worn. She nodded at Maigret without surprise, as if police in bakeries were a natural occurrence. "You cleaned last night?" he asked. "Yes, as usual." "You noticed anything unusual?" She paused for a fraction of a second. Number Y. "There was a loaf of bread here, one that didn't come from Monsieur Colin's oven." Her eyes flickered, just once, but it was enough. "I wouldn't know about that. I clean. I don't bake." Maigret didn't answer. Instead, he stood watching her as she removed her coat, hung it on a peg, and began tying an apron around her waist. She moved efficiently, but there was a certain tightness in her shoulders, a faint haste in her gestures. "You came in through the back last night," he said. "Yes. Always do." "And the door was open?" "No, I unlocked it." "Was anyone in the kitchen?" She shook her head. The boy was in the shop. Monsieur Colin was gone. There was another small silence. Maigret, still holding his unlit pipe, studied her face. She met his gaze, but there was a guardedness there, as though she were standing in a draught and had drawn her coat tighter. "All right," he said at last. "Carry on." He stepped back into the shop, Colin following. The baker's unease had grown. He spoke in a low voice. "You think she knows something?" "I think," Maigret said slowly, "that whoever put that loaf on your rack wanted it to be found, but not too quickly, and they knew this place well enough to be sure it would end up in your hands." Colin glanced toward the window, where the rain was softening again into mist. "You'll go to that address, Rue de la Roquette?" Maigret didn't answer directly. He looked instead at the loaf still on his desk in his mind's eye, the cramped handwriting on the note, the plain desperation of the two words, "Help me." He knew that if he went to number 41, the door might open onto a completely ordinary room, or nothing at all. But he also knew the letter had not been written for the police. It had been written for someone who could not be reached any other way. And that, in Maigret's experience, was rarely without reason. He adjusted his scarf, preparing to step back out into the wet street. The day was still young, and Paris, narrow streets, shuttered windows and all, had a way of letting its secrets slip when one was willing to walk slowly enough. The rain had slowed to a fine mist by the time Maigret reached Rue de la Roquette. It was one of those streets that never seemed entirely awake, even in daylight. A narrow artery of small shops with peeling paint, shuttered windows, and the occasional doorway where someone lingered just long enough to watch a passerby. The number he sought was toward the middle of the block, wedged between a tobacconist's and a shop selling second-hand clothing. From the street, it looked like a residential entrance, a wooden door with flaking blue paint, above which a small grimy transom window let in barely any light. He paused under the modest shelter of the tobacconist's awning, lighting his pipe. The act wasn't about the smoke, it gave him a moment to look without seeming to look. The door to number 41 remained shut, but a faint vibration, more felt than heard, suggested someone moving inside the building. He finished tamping the tobacco, slipped the match back into his pocket, and crossed the pavement. The door opened into a narrow, dim corridor with tiled walls whose glaze had dulled over decades. The air smelled faintly of cabbage and damp wool, the familiar perfume of old Paris apartment houses. The worn linoleum floor gave a faint squelch underfoot from the rainwater others had carried in before him. Somewhere upstairs, a radio was playing quietly, the sound distorted by the distance, a singer's voice rising and falling in muffled waves. A row of mailboxes lined one wall, each with a name in faded ink or penciled directly onto the metal. Most were unremarkable, but one caught his attention, a small compartment with no name at all, only a strip of tape across the slot. He ran his finger lightly over it, then moved on toward the staircase. He took the stairs slowly, one hand on the polished wooden rail, feeling the uneven rhythm of the building. On the first landing, a door stood slightly ajar, releasing the warm, greasy scent of cooking oil. A woman's voice called out sharply in some distant room, followed by a child's quick footsteps. Nobody appeared. The second-floor landing had two doors. One was closed and silent. The other bore a hand-painted number and a brass peephole. Maigret stood before it, listening. Nothing. He raised his hand and knocked once, gently. After a moment, the door opened just enough for a pale, narrow face to appear. A woman in her 30s, perhaps, her hair drawn back in a severe knot. Her eyes flickered to the scarf at his neck, then to the pipe in his hand, before returning to his face. "Yes?" "I'm looking for someone," he said evenly. "I was given this address." She hesitated, then opened the door a little wider. "Who?" "That's the difficulty," he said. "I don't know the name. Perhaps you can help me." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't think so. There's nobody here who wants the police." He didn't correct her assumption. Instead, he let the silence lengthen, his gaze steady, but not challenging. She shifted, one hand tightening on the edge of the door. "Who told you to come here?" she asked finally. "Someone who thought there might be trouble, someone who couldn't come themselves." For a fraction of a second, her expression softened. Then it was gone. "You should leave. There's nothing here for you." She started to close the door, but Maigret stepped forward. Not enough to force it, just enough to keep her from retreating entirely. "If that's true," he said quietly, "then you've nothing to fear from telling me so." A sound from inside interrupted them, a faint, deliberate cough, followed by the creak of floorboards. She glanced over her shoulder quickly, and in that movement something slipped. Her voice, when it came again, was lower. "Come back tonight, after 10, if you must." And before he could answer, the door closed firmly. Maigret remained a moment on the landing, listening to the muted sounds beyond the wood. 2 sets of footsteps, a low murmur, then nothing. He made his way down again, the smell of cabbage seeming stronger now. At the mailboxes, he paused once more, tracing the tape over the unmarked slot with his thumb. It was an old trick. To leave no name was to leave no trail for anyone who might come looking. Outside, the mist had thickened into a damp curtain. He turned his collar up and began walking toward the end of the street, letting the rhythm of his steps settle into his thoughts. It wasn't urgency that kept him from returning directly to the Quai des Orfèvres. It was the sense that pressing too hard, too soon, would scatter whatever threads there were. This was a place where people kept to themselves, where a stranger's questions would be remembered and talked about. He stopped at a small cafe on the corner, one of those narrow, unpretentious places where the regulars hardly looked up when the door opened. He took a seat near the window, ordered a beer, and lit his pipe again, watching the entrance to number 41 through the wavering condensation. Half an hour passed before the door opened again. The woman with the severe hair emerged, her head lowered against the drizzle, a small market basket on her arm. She crossed the street without looking around, disappeared into a grocer's 2 doors down. A few minutes later she reappeared, the basket now heavier, and returned to the building. It was ordinary enough, but Maigrè's attention had been caught not by her movements, but by something else, an older man who had been leaning against the tobacconist's doorway since before she left. He was still there when she returned, but this time, as she passed him, his head inclined slightly, almost imperceptibly. She didn't acknowledge him, but her pace quickened. The man lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating a narrow, sharp-featured face. He stayed where he was for another 10 minutes, then walked away toward Bastille. Maigret finished his beer, left a few coins on the table, and stepped back into the damp air. He did not follow the man. There was time for that later, if it became necessary. Instead, he made his way toward the nearest police post, where he could arrange for a quiet watch to be kept on number 41 until nightfall. No uniforms, no questions, just a pair of eyes to note who came and went. When he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the loaf of bread was still on his desk, the note folded beside it. The office felt warmer than before, but also more still, as if holding its breath. He stood looking at the note again, its ink smudged and hurried, and wondered how far it had travelled before reaching him. How many hands, how much care, to hide a message in something as simple as bread. It would be after 10 before he went back. Until then, the day would pass slowly, the way it always did when the next step was to wait. That was the part others often failed to understand. How much of the work was not in chasing, but in letting things come to you. And in Maigret's experience, they always did. The hours until nightfall stretched out with a peculiar stillness, as though the city itself had decided to slow its pulse. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret went through the motions of the day, answering a few routine queries, signing a stack of papers, but his mind remained fixed on that dim corridor in Rue de la Roquette, on the woman who had opened her door just enough to let him see the flicker of something she was trying to hide. He thought about her voice when she told him to come back after 10, the guarded urgency in it. It was late afternoon when Janvier came in, his overcoat damp, a faint smell of rain clinging to him. He dropped a brief report on Maigret's desk. "You wanted someone watching number 41. Lucas and I took turns." Maigret lit his pipe before opening the paper. "And?" "She went out again. Around 4. Same market basket. Went to the butcher's, then the dairy. Came back in less than 20 minutes. Nobody else visited her door, but..." He hesitated. "The fellow you mentioned, the one by the tobacconist, he came back. Different coat this time. Didn't stay long. Just passed the building twice, smoking. Looked up at her window once." Maigret grunted softly. "He noticed you. Not directly. He's careful, but not enough for us to lose him if we need to." "Not yet," Maigret said. "Tonight we'll see." By the time he left the Quai des Orfèvres, the rain had stopped altogether, leaving the streets washed clean and gleaming under the lamps. The air had that damp metallic smell Paris sometimes carries after a day of drizzle, as if the stones themselves had soaked up the weather. He walked part of the way, preferring the slow rhythm of his own pace to the confinement of a cab. It was a habit as much as a method. Walking gave him the measure of a place. Let him listen to the city's breath before stepping into the narrower world of a single building. When he reached Rue de la Roquette, the tobacconist's shop was closed, its shutters drawn. Number 41 looked unchanged, the blue paint on the door catching the light in uneven patches. He stood across the street a moment, filling his pipe. The second-floor window where he thought her room might be was dark. At a few minutes past 10, he crossed the street and pushed the door open. The corridor was quiet, the smell of cabbage fainter now, replaced by something sharper, polish, perhaps, as though someone had scrubbed the floors that afternoon. He took the stairs without hurry, the creak of each step oddly distinct in the stillness. The door opened before he could knock. She was there. The severe hair loosened now, falling in strands around her face. Her eyes were sharper in the dim light of the landing, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her voice when she said, "Come in." Quickly. The room was small, the walls papered in a faded floral pattern that had once been cheerful. A narrow bed stood against one wall, neatly made. Beside it, a table with a single chair. A gas ring and a chipped enamel pot served as the kitchen. Everything was clean, but in the way of someone who cannot afford not to keep things in order. He stood in the middle of the room while she closed the door, sliding a bolt into place. "You brought the letter," she said, not as a question. He nodded, taking it from his coat pocket. Her eyes went to it, and then away again, as if looking too long would give something away. "Who wrote it?" he asked. Her hands tightened on the edge of the table. "I can't tell you that." "You called me here," he said evenly. "You want me to know something." She turned toward the gas ring, as though the simple act of lighting it might give her time to think. A moment later, a thin blue flame flickered. She didn't put anything on it, just stood there, looking at the wall. "It's a woman," she said finally. "You won't find her here, not now. Maybe not ever." "Why did she write?" "She's afraid." "Of whom?" The woman looked over her shoulder. "If I tell you, you'll bring them here, and then it's over." Maigret said nothing. He sat in the chair, the pipe resting in his hand unlit. The silence thickened until she turned fully to face him. "She was here 2 nights ago. She left before dawn. She asked me to hide the note. She knew the baker, said if he found it he'd know what to do. I didn't understand until you came." "You baked the loaf?" Someone brought it, told me to put the note inside and make sure it went with the bread. Said it was the only safe way. I don't know if that was true, but..." Her voice trailed off. Maigret leaned forward slightly. "This someone, was it the man outside? The one by the tobacconist?" She didn't answer at once. Her gaze slid toward the window. "He watches. Always watching. For her. For anyone who might help her. She says he's dangerous." He took out his notebook but didn't open it. "What's her name?" The woman hesitated for so long he thought she wouldn't speak. "Claire," she said at last. "Claire Vionnet." The name meant nothing to him yet, but he knew it would by morning. "Where is she now?" "I don't know. She wouldn't say. She's been moving from place to place. She thinks if she stays anywhere too long..." The woman's voice broke off again. He didn't push her. Instead, he rose, slipping the note back into his coat. "If she comes here again, tell her nothing has changed, that she should find a way to see me." The woman nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. When he stepped back into the corridor, the air felt cooler, as though the walls themselves held the night in. Down on the street, the lamps cast long, glistening reflections across the wet pavement. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed and then faded into the city's murmur. He stood a moment under the awning, pipe between his teeth, watching the shadows along the street. No sign of the sharp-faced man. But Maigret knew enough now to be certain of one thing. This was no idle message. Someone had gone to careful, deliberate lengths to get it into his hands without being seen. And whoever Claire Vionnet was, she was somewhere in Paris tonight, waiting to see if her words inside a loaf of bread would be enough to change her fate. The night air clung to his coat as Maigret walked away from Rue de la Roquette, the quiet of the hour wrapping itself around him like an old, familiar coat. Paris after 10 had a different rhythm, a slower gait. The sounds of the day had receded, replaced by the occasional hiss of tires on wet cobblestones, the low murmur from a late café, the shuffling steps of someone taking the long way home. He did not hurry. The pieces were not yet ready to fit together, and he knew better than to force them. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the duty sergeant looked up from his desk, surprised to see him at that hour. Maigret simply nodded and went into his office. He did not light the overhead lamp, only the smaller desk lamp, which threw a warm pool of light over the loaf of bread and the folded note beside it. He sat down and tamped tobacco into his pipe, letting the match flare briefly before drawing the first quiet pull. The smoke curled upward, softening the edges of the room. Claire Vionnet. The name had no place yet in his mental map, but it would. He made a slow, deliberate call to the night clerk in records, asking him to check for anything under that name: arrests, witness statements, even minor complaints. The clerk grumbled but promised to have something by morning. He stayed at the desk longer than he needed to, going over what he had. The baker, hesitant but willing. The apprentice, nervous in a way that suggested omission rather than guilt. Madame Lemoine, guarded but responsive to the right pause. And now the woman in Rue de la Roquette, who spoke of Claire like someone afraid of speaking too loudly in an empty church. Then there was the sharp-faced man, twice present, twice watching. That was not chance. By the time he let himself into his apartment, the clock in the hall read 1:30. Madame Maigret stirred as he moved quietly into the bedroom, but she didn't ask. She had long since learned that the questions worth asking would be answered when he was ready. In the morning, the sky was a dull grey, the light filtering into the kitchen in a flat, colourless way that made the coffee seem darker than usual. He sat at the table, reading the paper without absorbing it, until Madame Maigret set a plate of bread and cheese in front of him. He ate slowly, his mind elsewhere. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the night clerk had left a thin folder on his desk. No criminal record for Claire Vionnet. A single mention from 2 years ago in a missing persons file. A neighbour in the 11th arrondissement had reported her absence, only for the matter to be quietly dropped a week later when she returned. No reason given, no follow-up. The address then had been near Rue Oberkampf. Janvier came in not long after, shrugging off his coat. "We've kept eyes on Rue de la Roquette. Your friend with the sharp face turned up again at dawn. Didn't go inside, just loitered, then walked toward Place Voltaire. Lucas followed him to a small café. He stayed there an hour, drinking coffee, reading nothing, speaking to no one. Then he left in the direction of Boulevard Richard Lenoir. Did Lucas follow all the way? Number. He lost him near the metro. Maigret nodded. We'll need his description and his habits. Janvier pulled out a notebook, flipping it open. Tall, lean, about 40, narrow nose, close-set eyes. Walks quickly, but when he stops, he's still. Too still. They spent the rest of the morning quietly mapping the immediate connections. The bakery, the Rue de la Roquette building, the possible link to the man. Maigret resisted the urge to go directly to Oberkampf. It was better to let the street and its people grow accustomed to being unobserved before stepping into their rhythm. By early afternoon, the baker, Colin, called again. His voice was low, almost reluctant. "Chief Inspector? That loaf, well, something else happened. A man came in this morning, asked for a country loaf. Not unusual, but when I handed it over, he squeezed it. Just once, like he was testing it. Then he smiled a little, thin sort of smile, and left without buying anything else." "What did he look like?" Colin hesitated. "Could be your man. Sharp face. That same careful way of moving." Maigret replaced the receiver slowly. It was too deliberate to ignore, this circling around bread like a cat testing the distance to its prey. If the man was searching for something, he either didn't know, or didn't believe, that the loaf had already served its purpose. By late afternoon, the grey light had deepened, and the air carried the faint promise of more rain. Maigret left the Quai des Orfèvres, walking again toward Rue de la Roquette, but not directly. He passed through quieter side streets, stopping once for a beer in a café where he could see the corner from a distance. The sharp-faced man was not there. Instead, a small boy in a worn cap lingered near the tobacconist's, his eyes alert in the way of those paid to notice comings and goings. Maigret crossed the street, pausing by the boy. "Cold day for standing still," he said. The boy shrugged. "I'm waiting." "For whom?" "Depends." "On?" "Who's asking?" Maigret smiled faintly. "Tell your friend the man with the pipe is looking for him." The boy's expression flickered, surprise first, then a guarded neutrality. He turned away without answering, melting into a side alley. Inside number 41, the corridor was quieter than the night before. He climbed to the second floor, but the woman's door stayed shut. No sound from inside. He knocked once, waited, then turned to leave. On the first landing, he heard a door open softly above him, followed by quick, careful footsteps descending the stairs. The woman caught up to him just before the door to the street. "She's not here," she whispered, "but she's close. She sent word. She wants to meet, tonight, midnight, the canal, near Rue de Crimée." Maigret studied her face, the tension in it. "And the man?" "He's closer too. She knows." He didn't press her further. Outside, the air had cooled, the street lamps throwing longer shadows. The city seemed to lean toward night. A meeting by the canal at midnight was not the kind of arrangement he liked. Too many angles, too many ways to be seen. But there was no choice now. Whoever Clairvionnet was, whatever she carried, the circle was tightening. And Maigret, walking back toward the Quai des Orfèvres with his coat collar turned up, felt that quiet, familiar certainty settle in his chest. The sense that the next hours would not unfold quickly, but they would matter. The rain, when it came again, would be light, almost absent-minded, as if Paris itself were content to watch and wait. The canal district at night had a peculiar emptiness, a quiet that was not quite peace. The water lay black and still between its stone banks, broken now and then by a slow ripple from something unseen beneath the surface. Street lamps threw pale, trembling reflections across it, and the long warehouses along the far side stood with their shutters closed, like watchful buildings that had nothing to say. Maigret arrived early, not by accident. He preferred to be in place before anyone else, to let the scene settle around him until he felt part of it. He stood at the corner where Rue de Crimée met the canal, pipe in hand, collar turned up against the chill. The mist was thicker here, clinging to the edges of the lamplight, softening outlines until faces became shadows and footsteps were more a suggestion than a sound. Across the water, a solitary figure walked slowly along the towpath, the faint echo of heels on stone carrying just far enough to make themselves known. The figure paused, glanced toward the bridge, then moved on. Not Claire. Too tall. Too certain in movement. At 5 minutes to midnight, a motorcar passed on the far street, its tires hissing over damp cobblestones, and the sound faded into the distance. The only other movement came from the occasional ripple near the moored barges. Then, from the shadow of a side street, a woman emerged. She was small, slight, her coat too thin for the night air. She walked with the caution of someone expecting to be stopped at any moment, her head turning slightly every few steps. Maigret stepped forward just enough to let her see him, but not enough to alarm her. She halted, recognition in her face, not of him personally, perhaps, but of the fact that he was the one she had been told to meet. "You're Clairvionnet?" he asked quietly. Her breath came out in a visible cloud. "Yes." She kept her distance, eyes flicking once toward the bridge, then back to him. "I don't have much time." "You put the note in the bread." She nodded quickly. "I didn't know another way. Letters can be opened, phones are listened to. But bread, it's ordinary. People don't think about it." "And what did you want me to know?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the mouth of the side street she'd come from. "He's looking for me." "The man with the sharp face?" "Yes, his name is André Lachaume. He works for someone. Someone I—" She stopped herself, biting her lip. "I left." I took something I shouldn't have. Not money. Papers. Letters. Her voice was quick, almost too quick, as though trying to get it all out before being interrupted. They're proof. About a deal. Illegal shipments. Stolen goods. I didn't care about that at first. But then, someone died. They said it was an accident. It wasn't. Maigret kept his tone even, his gaze steady. Where are the papers now? A faint, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Safe, for now. And why come to me? Because you don't work for them, and you don't owe them. The mist shifted, drawing a darker shape out of the shadows near the bridge. Maigret's eyes flicked to it without moving his head. Someone was standing very still, just beyond the circle of lamplight. Claire noticed it too. Her voice dropped. I have to go. If you leave now, he said quietly, he'll follow. She looked at him then, properly, for the first time. There was fear in her eyes, but also a certain resolve. Then you'll have to make him stop. She turned, moving quickly toward the bridge. The shadow detached itself from the wall, following at a distance that was too casual to be innocent. Maigret stepped out from the rail, pipe still in hand, and crossed toward the man. The mist seemed to part reluctantly around them. La Chaume? The man slowed but didn't stop. And if I am? You've been spending a great deal of time on Rue de la Roquette. That's my business. Maigret let the silence hang, the way he might in an interrogation room. It worked. The man shifted, eyes narrowing. You'd be wise, Maigret said finally, to keep your business away from women who come to me for help. A small, humorless smile flickered across La Chaume's face. She's trouble, Inspector. You'll find that out soon enough. He turned away, disappearing into the mist as though it had been waiting for him. Maigret stood for a moment longer, watching the ripples on the canal where the reflections of the lamps quivered and broke. The woman was gone now, vanished into one of the streets that wound away from the water. He did not follow her. If she was telling the truth, she had already survived longer than most in her position. But the margin was narrowing. He walked back toward the main road, his steps unhurried. Somewhere behind him, in the layers of mist and lamplight, the city was rearranging itself around what had just happened. By the time he reached the corner cafe, ordering a late coffee, the whole thing might already seem like a fragment of a dream, except for the faint taste of damp air in his mouth, and the certainty that the next move would not be hers or La Chaume's, it would be his. He slept less than usual and woke before the first light had fully decided itself. The apartment was quiet in that way. It often was when the street outside hadn't yet warmed to its traffic. The only sound came from the kitchen where Madame Maigret moved with careful economy, not clattering, not rushing. He shaved more slowly than he meant to, the blade pausing once at his cheek, as if it had reached a thought. The canal, the woman's thin coat, the mist that swallowed a face and gave nothing back. These were not the day's business of the Quai des Orfèvres, not yet, and yet they already had the shape of something the day would have to take into itself. He came to the table, and she poured his coffee without comment. The bread on the plate was from Colin's bakery. He recognized the crust and thought about the pale loaf with the paper baked into its heart. He cut a piece and spread butter on it and chewed as if it might tell him more. "You're thinking," she said, not looking up, wiping a small damp ring from the table and then wiping the cloth itself. He nodded. "It's the weather for it," she added. "This damp that gets into people. They do funny things when it doesn't stop raining." He smiled a little at that, and she took it for the answer it was. After a moment she said, "If you want people to tell you the truth, you should see them before 11. After that, they've had time to remember what they meant to say." She wasn't teasing. It was something she believed, like the fact that coffee should be poured while it is still breathing steam. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors were already busy. A messenger with a new uniform hurried past, eyes down, as if speed could keep him from being sent back with a correction. Janvier arrived with the grey of the morning on his coat. He had two things, a note from records and a look that suggested he had left a café before finishing his cup. La Chaume, he said, laying the paper down. No convictions. He was questioned once in connection with a warehouse theft at Ivry 3 years ago. Let go. Since then, he's been around the canal. Odd jobs, some security, some hauling. Nothing on paper. There's a name with him sometimes, a certain Garin. Runs a small shipping and storage concern near La Villette. On paper, it's clean. In practice, he lifted his eyebrows and didn't finish. And Claire Vionnet. Nothing new beyond what you've got. There is a connection, though, with Rue Oberkampf. 3 letters addressed to her there a year ago, posted from the north. The return name is a woman, Pauline Morel. The letters were never collected. The concierge says they were returned to sender after 3 weeks. She remembers because she used to keep the unclaimed mail in a shoebox with elastic around it. Where's the box? Gone. But the concierge remembers the handwriting, tight, angry. Maigret lit his pipe and let the first mouthful of smoke sit heavy on his tongue. Garin, he repeated, as if tasting the name would help. And a concern near La Villette. He did not go there yet. He sent Lucas instead, with instructions to do nothing that could be called doing something. A walk past the frontage, a look at the doors, a counting of men's faces, a way of standing long enough that someone would mark him without being able to say why. Then he gathered his coat and went out, leaving paper and day-to-day cases to the others. He did not walk toward the canal this time. He walked toward Rue Oberkampf, with the slow precision he reserved for streets where people remembered faces. The concierge at the number Janvier had given him was one of those women who had made a home in her lodge, plants and a calendar with a kitten, a glass bowl with keys that were never the right ones. She told him the story twice, then a third time with the bits she had not thought important, how the woman Claire came and went at odd hours, always carrying a bag too light to justify the way she held it, like a habit she could not put down. How there was once a man who waited in the doorway across the street but who smoked without staining his fingers, which meant he didn't smoke until he needed to. How, on a certain Saturday, a taped-over name appeared on one of the mailboxes and came off again 2 days later, leaving a shadow of glue as long as a thumb. And Pauline Morel? Maigret asked. A northern woman, I think. I heard the accent once, on the telephone. No address. He stood a moment in the corridor, and then not far from the building, where he could see the windows without seeming to. Ordinary glass, ordinary curtains, a line where a plant might have been. He waited long enough to let the street make up its mind about him, and then moved on. Back at the office, Lucas had returned. Garin's place is a large shed with a narrow door, he said dryly. The men go in 2 at a time, but never 3, as if they've been told not to make a crowd. There are barrels, some marked with paint, some with nothing. The smell is not only oil, there is also soap. I don't mean the smell of soap. I mean the smell of something being washed. Washed of what? Lucas lifted one shoulder. Numbers. They were interrupted by Inspector Lognon, who arrived with his usual cloud, a man forever somewhere between a cold and an injustice. He held a file like a handkerchief. If you have finished strolling by the canal, he said, to no one in particular. There's a note from the examining magistrate asking why certain matters have not advanced to where they can be said to have advanced. He imagines there is a motor car in everything, preferably 2. Perhaps there is a motor car, Maigret said mildly. You will tell him we are still looking for it. If he insists, tell him it is in the wash. Lognon scowled, but there was a sideways twitch at the corner of his mouth. He lingered, waiting for permission to ask what he was already asking with his eyes. Maigret did not oblige him. When Lognon had gone, he said to Janvier, "Find out if Garin has a wife. Of course. Or a sister, or a housekeeper who is not called a housekeeper, someone who buys the soap." He went out again after that, not to La Villette and not to the canal, but to the bakery, where the bell on the door rang with the small, resigned sound that all bells of bakeries make after noon. Colin looked up and then down again, as if embarrassed to have any part in a police matter in a room that smelled of sugar. "Has he been back?" Maigret asked. "The man? Number." But someone telephoned for a delivery of country loaves, not croissants or baguettes, country loaves. 6. Where to? A café near Boulevard Voltaire. The owner said it was for a private gathering. He wanted them unsliced. "And you?" I said yes. Why wouldn't I? "You wouldn't," Maigret said, "if the voice on the telephone wanted you to put something in the bread." Colin stared at him. "Do you think—" "I think someone chooses ordinary things because ordinary things are not watched." "What time?" 6 this evening. Maigret stepped back out and walked toward Boulevard Voltaire because it was still a while until 6, and because he liked to see a place in daylight before he saw it as a scene. The café was one of those with tables that had not been new in 20 years and mirrors that clouded wherever breath touched. The owner, when he came, had a manner built of courtesy and calculation. "We are expecting a small party," he said. "A group. They want the back room." "Who are they?" "I don't know them all. There is a gentleman called Garin." It was said as one says the name of a tradesman who pays on time. The man did not know or pretended not to know more. He insisted on showing Maigret the back room, out of pride as much as cooperation. There was a long table and a hatch to the kitchen, and a door to the yard where a man could smoke without being seen from the street. The tablecloth had a small fray at one end, repaired with white thread that didn't match the original. "Do you often host men who ask for bread that is not sliced?" Maigret inquired. The owner smiled. "I host men who ask for the second bottle to be put on the bill of the first. Compared to that, unsliced bread is a virtue." When he came out again, the day had hardened into its late light. He stopped at a kiosk and bought a paper he would not read. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he told Janvier to borrow a boy who could carry a basket and not be told he was carrying something at all. He telephoned Colin and said there would be 7 loaves, not 6, and that the 7th would be very ordinary and very empty inside. He told him to accept any special request the customer might add. He waited then, the way he always waited, not passively, but like someone holding a door half open to hear what moved behind it. At 5, he walked home for a few minutes and sat in the kitchen while Madame Maigret peeled carrots with the clean, repetitive sound of someone who had always done it this way. He told her only that there would be a late supper. "Then don't eat the bread at the café," she said. "They dry it out back there. It's always the same with back rooms." He laughed, and she looked pleased the way she always did when she could add some domestic law to his unwritten code. When he left, she put a small parcel into his coat pocket. "You'll be cross if you are hungry," she said, which was not a warning, but an old truth. The evening came down without ceremony. Men who had decided to be on time arrived at the café's side door, as if by instinct, neither early nor late. The boy from the bakery came with his basket and went in by the kitchen, as he had been told. Maigret didn't go inside. He stood where he could see the back door, and a sliver of the yard, pipe unlit, the taste of tobacco already there. Janvier, somewhere else, watched the street. Lucas, farther off, watched for a car that might have been washed of its numbers. It was Garin who came to the yard first, a man put together from neatness. Neat hair, neat moustache, neat impatience. He took a cigarette from a case and didn't light it, then put it back as though he had proved something to himself by not wanting it. A moment later, Lachaume joined him. They spoke with their bodies turned half away from the door, as if not to admit they were speaking at all. A woman passed along the pavement outside, quick, head down, not Claire. Another minute and a shadow crossed the far end of the yard and didn't stop. Inside, a chair scraped, a bottle was uncorked. Ordinary sounds, the kind that lay camouflage over other movements. When the bread came to the table, there was a small pause in the room. No hush, Just that slight kink in the air when men who do not share secrets expect to share something anyway. Garin cut one loaf. He pressed the knife down more than the bread required, as if the resistance under the crust could tell him what he was cutting into. He cut a second, and then one more. He paused before the fourth, then set it aside and chose another, as if to keep from appearing consistent. Maigret did not need to be in the room to feel the attention move, as a dog feels a change in a house he knows by heart. It moved to the bread and away again, moved to the hatch to the kitchen and back to the table, moved to the door with its bolt drawn halfway, then to the yard where two men had drawn the night over their shoulders and were pretending it was a coat. When, after a few minutes, Lachaume came back out with the fourth loaf in his hand, whole, unsliced, Maigret felt the evening arrive at the edge it had been approaching, since a note was baked into a pale crust. Lachaume weighed the bread as if it were a decision, then tucked it under his arm and crossed the yard. He did not look around. A man who looks around is telling anyone who might be watching that he wants to know whether anyone is watching. Maigret waited until the gate to the alley clicked, and then took 3 steps that did not look like 3. He came up beside Lachaume at the mouth of the alley, close enough that the man caught his smell before he saw his face. "You've chosen well," Maigret said softly. "It's very ordinary tonight." Lachaume's eyes flickered to the bread. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his careful stillness. He stood with the loaf between his hands, as if unsure whether to hold it closer or let it go. Somewhere behind them, a chair in the back room skidded an inch and stopped. In the kitchen, a girl laughed once and then remembered not to. "You could make this easy," Maigret went on, not moving. "You could tell me who you expect to read what isn't there." The man wet his lips and did not answer. The loaf shifted an inch. He had expected a message and found only weight. And weight tells its own kind of truth. In that small moment, something that had been tight in him eased not into relief, but into anger. At the wrong loaf, at the wrong night, at being made to hold nothing when he had come for something. Maigret watched that anger take him by the jaw. It brought them closer to the place where people speak without meaning to, closer to the place where a woman in a thin coat might step back into a story and not be swallowed by it. He did not push. He let the man's silence lengthen until it became a shape he would have to walk around or through. "Come along," Maigret said at last, very gently, as if proposing a short stroll. "We'll talk where the air is warmer." Lachaume didn't move at first, and for a moment Maigret thought he might turn away into the alley. But the man shifted the loaf under his arm, glanced once toward the cafe's back door, and then followed without a word. They walked side by side, the sound of their shoes flattened by the damp cobblestones. The street was quiet except for the faint, irregular hum of traffic a few blocks away. Maigret led him toward the main road, but not in haste. The rhythm of the walk was part of the work. A man will talk more often in the in-between spaces, when he thinks the moment of reckoning hasn't quite arrived. They passed under a street lamp where the mist seemed thicker, the light pooling at their feet. "You've been looking for something in bread," Maigret said evenly, as if they were discussing the weather. Lachaume's mouth twitched. "You make it sound ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous if you believe it will be there." The man didn't reply. His hands shifted slightly on the loaf, as though weighing it again. "You knew Claire Vionnet," Maigret continued. "I've seen her," Lachaume said after a pause. "She moves in and out of places she doesn't belong. And she left something she shouldn't have taken." Lachaume gave a small, dry laugh. "She left trouble, that's all." They turned a corner where the light from a shuttered shop spilled weakly onto the pavement. Maigret could see Janvier ahead, leaning in the shadow of a doorway, watching without watching. He made no move to join them. "Tell me about Garin," Maigret said. "Tell you what. He runs his business. I do odd jobs. Sometimes you need to keep things off the books. Sometimes you need to move something without the wrong people asking questions. And sometimes you put a note in a loaf of bread. That drew a flicker of irritation. Not me. And not Garin. But if she thinks she can hide from him. He stopped himself. From him? Lachaume shook his head, the movement sharp, as if batting away a fly. Forget it. They reached the Quai des Orfèvres without another word. Inside, the building's late-night quiet seemed to press in on them, footsteps echoing faintly down the tiled corridors. In Maigrè's office, the lamp cast its steady circle of light on the desk. He gestured to the chair opposite, and Lachaume sat, setting the loaf down between them like an object that had been at the centre of the evening's gravity. Maigret didn't open it. He simply looked at it for a moment before speaking again. You were expecting something inside. Lachaume's eyes narrowed. Maybe. Or maybe I wanted to make sure there wasn't. And why would it matter? His jaw tightened, and then he exhaled slowly. Because if she's still carrying what I think she is, it'll get her killed, and anyone who touches it. What is it? The man looked away, his gaze fixed on a dark patch of the wall. Letters, contracts, things signed by the wrong hands. If you've got them, you can ruin people. If you've lost them, you're already ruined. Where did she get them? That's her story, not mine. Maigret leaned back in his chair, watching the other man's face. There was something there, resentment, perhaps, or the thin edge of fear. And Garin? Garin doesn't care about her. He cares about what she's carrying, but he doesn't have the patience to find it himself. That's where I come in. And yet here you are, with the wrong loaf. Lachaume allowed himself a small, mirthless smile. You're quick, Inspector. Quicker than her, maybe. She thinks she's clever, but clever doesn't last. Sooner or later, someone's patience runs out. Maigret tapped the stem of his pipe against the edge of the desk. And yours? The man didn't answer. Maigret stood, opened the office door, and called for Janvier. See that Monsieur Lachaume gets home, he said, the tone as casual as if they'd finished a card game, and make sure he doesn't lose his bread along the way. When they were gone, the room seemed to exhale. Maigret poured himself a small glass of beer from the bottle in the corner and sat again, pipe unlit, eyes on the loaf. He knew it was empty, but it had still brought something to the surface. Enough to tell him that whatever Claire carried was more than a scrap of paper with a plea for help. It had weight, and people were moving in circles around it. He left the office after 1, walking home through streets where the night had thinned to its quietest hour. In the apartment, Madame Maigret stirred in her sleep when he slipped into bed, but said nothing. The morning brought a fine, cold rain that blurred the outlines of the buildings across the Seine. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was waiting with a report. Garin was at his warehouse early, met with 2 men, both strangers to us. They left together in a covered truck. No markings. Where to? Toward the ring road. Lost them near Porte de Pantin. Maigret nodded, not disappointed. The city had its own way of giving back what was lost, but not all at once. He lit his pipe and thought of Rue de la Roquette, of Claire's quick eyes and thin coat, of Lachaume's tight grip on an empty loaf. The rain outside tapped lightly against the window, as if reminding him that nothing in this case had come directly. It had all been carried in small, ordinary ways, passed from hand to hand, from room to street, from shadow to light. And if he was patient enough, it would come to him the same way. The rain did not stop all morning. It came in fine, steady lines that softened the edges of everything, making the Quai des Orfèvres seem smaller from his office window. Maigret kept the lamp on despite the hour, its light pooling over the papers on his desk, over the loaf Lachaume had carried, now cut open and lying in 2 harmless halves. There had been nothing inside but the dense crumb and the faint smell of rye. Still, the way the man had held it told Maigret it had been more than bread to him. It had been a hope, or a fear, perhaps both. Janvier came in without knocking, shaking water from his hat. I had a word with the boy from the tobacconist's, he said. The one you spoke to near Rue de la Roquette. He wasn't paid much, just enough to watch for you, or for her. Lachaume gave him the coins directly. Said if she came or went, he should follow her as far as he could without being seen. Did he ever see her? Yes, twice. The last time she was carrying a small leather satchel. He said she looked tired, like she hadn't slept. Maigret tamped tobacco into his pipe, thinking. And he didn't follow her the second time? He said he lost her in the crowd near Bastille, but I think he stopped when Lachaume told him to. The inspector struck a match, let the flame curl into the bowl. If she's carrying those papers still, she's not far. She's not the kind to run far. Not yet. Not yet? Janvier asked. Maigret exhaled smoke slowly. People like her. They move in short bursts, from one safe place to another, because each step takes more from them. The longer she carries that satchel, the heavier it will feel. By midday, the rain had eased enough to make walking possible without a soaked coat. Maigret left the building and took a slow route toward Rue de la Roquette, passing through smaller streets where the gutters still ran with thin streams. The building at number 41 was quiet, its entrance door closed. He pressed the buzzer for the second floor, but there was no answer. The concierge's lodge was empty, except for the smell of polish and the faint warmth from a small stove. He waited a few minutes, then turned back into the street. At the corner, a narrow shop sold second-hand furniture, its window crowded with chairs and side tables. The shopkeeper looked up as he entered, his face wary until Maigret named himself. "You see the building across the way?" Maigret asked. The man nodded. "Anyone come or go in the last day?" "Only the woman from the second floor," the shopkeeper said. "She left early this morning with a man, not Lachaume, shorter, heavier, a cap pulled low. They had no luggage. They walked toward the metro." Maigret filed the description away and stepped back into the street. It could have been anyone, a friend, a relative, or someone offering help she couldn't refuse. But if she had left with that satchel, she had taken her risk into someone else's hands. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was waiting. "I've been to La Valette again." Garin's warehouse was locked. No one there but a young fellow sweeping the yard. Said Garin's gone south for a few days. No address. Maigret didn't believe the gone south part, not entirely. He pictured the covered truck Lucas had mentioned, heading toward the ring road, and imagined it taking not the open route, but one that slipped between smaller towns, where eyes were fewer and questions less persistent. In the late afternoon, Colin telephoned from the bakery. "I don't know if this matters," he began, his voice low. "But Madame Lemoine hasn't been in since yesterday. No word, no message." "She was supposed to clean today?" "Yes. She's never missed a day before." After he hung up, Maigret sat back, the pipe cooling in his hand. It wasn't coincidence. Claire's disappearance from Rue de la Roquette, Madame Lemoine's sudden absence, Garin vanishing into some convenient south. The threads were pulling in the same direction. He sent Janvier to check the woman's small flat in the 12th arrondissement. It was dark when the inspector returned, his hat still damp. Door locked. No answer. Neighbours say they saw her leave last night with a man. Same description as the one from the shopkeeper near Rue de la Roquette. He was carrying a folded raincoat under one arm. "Could be the same man," Maigret said. "And if it is, he's not acting on his own." The evening wore in without hurry, but Maigret didn't go home. He stayed in his office, letting the building's night sounds settle around him, the distant clatter of typewriter, keys, a file drawer sliding shut, the muted footsteps of someone passing in the corridor. At 9, the telephone rang. It was the boy from the tobacconist's again, his voice quick. "She's back, not at Rue de la Roquette, near the canal. I saw her go into a café by Quai de la Marne. She still has the satchel." Maigret was on his feet before the boy had finished speaking. He told him to stay put and watch the door. The air outside was colder now. the damp sharper against his face as he made his way north. When he reached the cafe, its windows were fogged, the yellow light inside turning the shapes of its few patrons into silhouettes. Claire was at a corner table, the satchel at her feet, her coat damp at the shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression, a mix of relief and resignation, told him she had expected him eventually. "You've been moving," he said, sitting opposite her. "I had to. It's not safe anywhere for long. And Madame Lemoine?" She hesitated. "She's with someone who said he could help. I don't know if she believes him, but she went. And the satchel?" Her foot nudged it closer to her chair. "It's here. But they know I have it. Garin, Lachaume, maybe others. I can't keep it much longer." "You'll give it to me," he said simply. Her eyes searched his, looking for the trap in the offer. "If I do, they'll come for you instead." "They already are," Maigret said, his tone as calm as if they were discussing the bill. She looked away then, toward the window, where the rain had begun again, streaking the glass. The satchel was between them now, and the moment felt like the closing of a door they had both been standing in for too long. Whatever was inside would have to be opened, and once it was, nothing in this case would be ordinary again. He didn't reach for the satchel at once. The cafe had the smell of boiled coffee and damp wool, and the window pane nearest their table ticked softly under the fresh rain. A man at the counter stirred his drink long after the sugar must have dissolved, eyes on nothing in particular. Claire kept both hands wrapped around her cup, though she wasn't drinking. The steam had thinned to a faint halo and then gone. "When you wrote the note," Maigret said, "you'd already decided the police were the least dangerous of your choices." She gave a small, rueful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I decided to test whether there was anyone left who wasn't bought. And the bakery. I used to live near there. Before I moved too many times to say where I live. I knew the old owner. He'd slip leftover bread to people who were shy about asking. He died last year, didn't he? Sold to Colin and died soon after." She nodded, as if the confirmation mattered less than the remembering. "He would have known what to do with a message like that. I told Madame Lemoine to use his shop. It seemed cleaner than the post. You knew her before the cleaning work. She used to keep the staircase clean when I was at Oberkampf. It's not the same work, but the habit is the same. She thinks nobody sees the person with a bucket and a rag. That's why I asked her. And because she doesn't talk unless someone gives her permission to." "You trust easily," he said, without judgment. "I borrow trust when I don't have any," she answered, and then, after a moment, pushed the satchel with her shoe until it knocked gently against his chair leg. He bent, lifted it, and set it on his knee. The leather had softened at the corners and took his fingerprints without showing them. The clasp opened with a soft click. He didn't spread its contents on the table. He looked once, then closed it again, as if he had confirmed the existence of something without needing to parade it. "They will follow it," she said in a low voice. "Even if they don't know where it is, they will follow the feeling of it." He looked at her face a long moment, the faint shadows under the eyes that only come from nights measured in corners and benches, the line at the mouth that suggested a stubbornness not yet spent. "Who died?" he asked gently. Her eyes lifted in a small shock, as if she had been holding the name in the back of her throat and didn't expect to be offered the space to say it. "A boy. Not a boy, really. 20. He worked nights at Garin's place. He joked with the drivers and smoked behind the shed and told me he'd save enough for a motorbike. He drowned in the canal." "Which canal?" "This one, near La Valette, in June. They wrote accident. They said he drank. He didn't. He had hands like a mechanic and eyes like someone who never learned to be suspicious. He used to help me lift the ledgers. That's all. He was there the night I saw them wash a crate with something that made my eyes sting. They were changing the markings. He laughed, said I was too serious, and then he was gone." "What was his name?" She swallowed once. "René. He heard the word, the way you hear a stone drop into water and then not break the surface again." He nodded, as if he now knew a street that had been missing from his map. "Why did you have the letters?" he asked. "The man who wrote them kept copies." He shouldn't have. They were sent to a woman in the north, Pauline Morel. She has a small company that ships things that are not always shoes or blankets, even when the boxes say so. The copies were in a drawer beside his bed. He thought keeping them in a private place made them safe because the office was what people would search. The man? She shook her head. He was afraid of Garin and proud of the signatures. That's all I can say. Pride makes people put their names on things they shouldn't. Pride, or a promise, Maigret said quietly. People sign to bind other people as much as themselves. She stared at him, then away, toward the window again. "Do you always talk like this?" "Only when the coffee's bad." That drew the smallest real smile from her, the kind that looks not at the mouth, but at the relief in the eyes. It went as quickly as it came. "Where is Madame Lemoine now?" he asked. "With a man who said she should go south if she knew what was good for her. He bought her a ticket and carried her bag down the stairs. He touched her elbow like a nephew. She doesn't have nephews." "The cap," Maigret murmured, almost to himself. He saw again the shape of the man in the shopkeeper's memory, cap low, carrying a folded raincoat under his arm. "And you?" "I walked the other way. Sometimes going the opposite way is all you can afford." He paid for the coffee, and they stepped out together, the rain finer now, a suggestion more than a fact. He did not offer her his arm. He matched his pace to hers, which was its own kind of offering. They didn't talk on the short walk to a police car that did not look like a police car. He opened the back door without making a ceremony of it. She got in with the wariness of someone not yet done deciding whether this was a mistake. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he led her through the corridor at a time of day when the building felt neither empty nor full. He put her not in an interview room, but in his office, where the lamp made a circle of warmth and the air smelled faintly of his tobacco and damp wool. He set the satchel on the desk. She sat with her coat on, fingers on the seams, as if they were a rosary. Janvier came to the door and paused when he saw her. Maigret handed him the satchel. "Put this in the safe," he said, not lowering his voice. "Make a note of the time." When Janvier had gone, Maigret poured a glass of water and set it on the desk within reach. She didn't touch it. The silence grew roots and settled. "You won't ask me the names," she said at last. "I will, but not like a man taking dictation." He leaned back. "Sometimes people tell you what they want you to do with the names when they tell you the names. You, I think, are tired of being told what to do." She was very still. Then her hands left the seams of her coat and folded once upon themselves. "There is one name you will find in there that will make someone very loud," she said. "Not Garin. Someone who wears his decency in public like a good overcoat. Loudness is a good way to hear where the walls are thin," he said. A soft knock preceded the duty clerk with a telegram. It was not for him. It had been misdirected and then redirected. He set it aside and didn't open it until after the clerk had gone. It was from Records in the North, responding to a query Janvier had sent about Pauline Morel. The words were brief, bureaucratic, and yet human enough between the lines. Legitimate small shipper. No complaints. A brother dead in 1940. A habit of writing letters that were too long for their envelopes. "Does Pauline know what she's shipping?" he asked. "She knows what she's told," Claire said. "And what the paper says?" "The paper says linens. I saw the crates marked the same and filled with something that could be poured like syrup and burned like a whisper." "Then Pauline is naive, or she is paid to be naive." "Is there a difference?" Claire asked, and the question had no bitterness in it, only fatigue. He stood and went to the window, though there was nothing in it he hadn't seen already. He had the sense of arriving at a room he had been working his way to all week, the room where the air is different without anything being visible, where a thing has been named and therefore exists in a way it didn't when it was just a suspicion. Behind him, he heard her exhale for the first time since they had come in. The office soaked up the sound and gave nothing back. The telephone rang. He lifted it and listened. It was Lucas, his voice pitched low. "The truck," he said. "We found it, in an alley off Rue Petit, parked as if for the night, but the engine is warm." "Garin?" "Number 2 men. Strangers to me. One went into a building that smells like new paint." "Stay with it," Maigret said. "Don't make it a matter." He hung up and turned back to Claire. "You'll stay here for now," he said. "There's a room where nobody will bother you. You can sleep." "I won't," she said, and then, with a ghost of humour, "But it's kind of you to pretend that people like me sleep." He opened the door for her and walked her down the corridor to a small room with a narrow bed and a chair. The sheets were too clean in the way of sheets that spend most of their lives being folded. He didn't say it was safe. He said he'd be outside. On his way back to the office, he passed Lognan, who looked aggrieved to discover that things were happening while he spent his morning with a magistrate. "If there is anything to be signed," Lognan said, "I prefer to sign it before lunch. After lunch, the magistrate likes to hear himself explain the meaning of signatures." "There will be signatures," Maigret said, not unkindly. "And there will be someone who explains them to a judge who does not like being explained to." In his office, he opened the satchel properly. He didn't spread the letters in a fan. He took them one by one. The paper had the weight of official stationery, and the faint odour of a desk kept too neat. The signatures were neat too, and one was neatest of all, a hand he recognised from newspapers and committee reports, and from the small plaque on a door at the prefecture, a man with a firm handshake who sat on panels about what to do with the city's goods and the men who moved them. Maigret read a paragraph and then another. He didn't make a face. He struck a match instead, held it a second too long, and lit his pipe. The smoke curled and then settled. He found, in the bottom of the satchel, an envelope addressed in a tight, almost stingy hand. "Mademoiselle Vionnet. To be opened if the other papers are taken." Inside was a single sheet with 2 lines, unsigned. He read them again, then put the page face down on the desk. It wasn't a confession. It was worse. It was permission dressed as advice. There came a knock he knew to expect. Madame Maigret, when she telephoned the front desk, never announced herself. The sergeant transferred the call and cleared his throat, as if to warn him it was not a call to be taken, with a notebook in hand. "Are you eating?" she asked, and the question covered a dozen others she would not ask in this voice. "I am," he said. "More or less." "It is a day for soup," she said. "Come if you can. If not, there will be soup when you can." He thanked her and hung up. The domestic remark turned in his head the way a key turns in a lock that has been stiff a long time. Soup. Not the word itself, but the way it implied warmth, a room where someone waited without fuss. People risked a great deal for rooms like that, for the illusion of them, if nothing else. A woman in a thin coat had risked enough to bake a message into bread. A boy had died because he thought the world would let him have a motorbike if he laughed at the right moments. A man with a careful moustache would pretend to be surprised when asked why his name was under other names. He called Janvier back in and handed him the page with the neatest signature. "Quietly," he said. "Ask for his schedule this week. Where he dines, who takes his hat. We will not knock at his door yet. We will open it in our heads and see who stands behind him. And Garin will come of his own accord the moment he hears that we have not knocked. And Lachaume, hungry, he will talk when he thinks the bread is all gone." They both smiled at that without amusement. The clock in the corridor chimed a quarter hour. The rain had become a suggestion again, fine as dust, the kind that sits on a city's shoulders and makes every gesture a little heavier. When Janvier had gone, Maigret sat a while longer with the satchel open and the room quiet around him. He didn't feel triumphant. He never did at this point. What he felt was the shape of the thing, at last, in his hands. Not a twist, not a trap, only the ordinary machinery of people wanting a little more than they should and a little less trouble than they've earned. and the way those two wishes grind against each other until someone breaks. He stood, put out his pipe by pressing the bowl against the heel of his palm, and slipped the satchel into the safe. When the iron door closed, the click was small, almost polite. It sounded, he thought, like the end of one kind of waiting and the beginning of another. It was 3 days before the name on the neatest signature learned, through channels that served him well until now, that Maigret had the papers. He came in by appointment, not summons, walking into the Quai des Orfèvres with the controlled dignity of a man convinced that appearances are a form of evidence. His hat was brushed, his coat collar flat, his eyes steady, until they weren't. Maigret had arranged the room without ceremony, his desk bare except for the satchel, closed. The rain outside was thin enough to make the windows blur but not run, so that the city beyond seemed paused in mid-step. "You have something of mine," the man began. "I have something," Maigret allowed, "that has your name on it. That's not quite the same thing." The man's voice had the measured politeness of someone accustomed to dictating minutes. "These papers are private. They are of no relevance to your work." "They're of relevance to a boy who drowned," Maigret said. "To a woman who's been moving from one cold bed to another because you've set men to follow her. To a crate scrubbed clean of its real markings. And to the fact that you've signed your approval for shipments that didn't exist on paper until you said they did." The man's hands flattened on the desk. "Do you have any idea what you're implying?" "I'm not implying," Maigret said. "I'm telling you what the papers show, and what witnesses can confirm. You'll find the names familiar. Garin, Lachaume. They're not here today because they think, perhaps, you'll make their part go away. But you won't." The silence stretched. Outside, a car passed, sending a small spray of water against the curb. "You can make this noisy," Maigret went on, "or you can make it quiet. Quiet means the girl sleeps tonight in one place without the fear of someone at her door. It means Madame Lemoine can take her mop and bucket back to where they belong. It means the boy's mother knows how he ended up in the canal. It also means that when this is all written down, it's about a mistake you allowed, not a business you ran." The man's eyes, at last, betrayed calculation. "And noisy." Maigret drew on his pipe, then let the smoke drift upward. "Noisy means the magistrate enjoys himself for months." In the end, it was not guilt that moved him, but the practical weight of consequences. He left the office without his satchel, his coat buttoned high, as if the damp air might listen. That evening, Janvier reported that Garin had been seen in a different café than usual, his voice lower than usual. Lachaume, alone, had been standing at the edge of the canal, staring at the water without moving for 10 minutes. Claire came in the next morning, summoned by nothing more than a message left with the café on Quai de la Marne. She looked less taut, though her coat was still too thin. Maigret handed her a single folded sheet, the brief statement that closed the boy's death as under investigation in relation to other matters. It was not justice, not yet, but it was the stone moved from the top of the hill. "You'll still have to be careful," he said. "I've been careful a long time," she answered, then paused. "It's different now, though, isn't it?" "Different enough," he said. She left without looking back, disappearing into the same rain she'd arrived in, only now it seemed to him the street took her in rather than swallowed her. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped altogether. Maigret sat by his office window, pipe cooling in his hand, watching the Seine carry along the small debris of the city's day. A leaf, a scrap of paper, something that might have been a feather. Cases like this didn't end with a gavel. They ended like the weather, with a change you only noticed after it had already happened. He thought of the loaf of bread on Colin's counter, pale crust, hidden note. A strange way to ask for help, but it had worked, and in his experience, that was enough.